Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host for East Brunswick Television. I'm here in the Ralston Cider Mill Museum, located in Mendham, New Jersey, and I'm with my friend James Malchow, who's the director of the museum, and my colleague, Professor Maria Kennedy from Rutgers, and we're going to be discussing the history of cider making with special reference to cider making in New Jersey. Maria, give James a little bit about your background in cider making.
Sure. So I studied cider making in England, where I worked for a cider maker in Herefordshire, a county in the west of England, and I wrote my dissertation about that. So I'm really interested to learn more about the history of cider in America now that I'm living back here in America. And I've done a little bit in New York, but I'm really excited to find out about New Jersey.
Well, it's nice that you're at Rutgers, New Jersey State University, because New Jersey has a great history with cider making, and that's part of the story that we tell here at the Ralston Mill.
So James, I know that apples are used to make hard cider, but they're also used to make apple jack, which is a spirit. And you were showing me this book a little bit earlier about that in New Jersey.
Right. Applejack used to be a huge industry in New Jersey, and this book was published in the 1950s and talks about what a big industry it was all throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. And our mill was one of several distilleries just in this town. There were 7 in Mendham, 11 in Chester, and I think 64 in total in Morris County, all producing applejack out of the local harvest. And it could be shipped all over the country, it could be consumed any time of year, and it was a really effective way for farmers to make their crops more valuable in the market.
So could you tell me why there's a cider mill right here in this very spot?
Well, oftentimes you'd have a lot of mills in the same place, and that's because they run off of streams. And you might have one mill up the stream and one mill here and one mill down the stream, and they all reuse the same water. On the other side of the road is a mill pond, and the water would come into the building, turn the wheel and run the machinery, then exit out the building and rejoin the stream down there. And where we are in Ralston, it was, for the 19th century, a very industrial area. There was a mill down the road, there's this mill, there's Old Mill Road, not far up the street, and tells you that up there was another one. And so it was very common for there to be lots of mills in one area because of the water power that they were using.
Oh, that's so interesting. Do you think we can see inside the mill?
Of course.
Great. So we're down in the belly of the building now, and it's really dark and cold down here, but this is where the power for the whole mill happens, right?
That's right. This was originally a grist mill built in the 1840s, and it's a lot of what you see is typical for a grist mill. It's got heavy, thick stone walls, and beside me here is what we call the wheel pit, where there was originally a wooden water wheel. Water, like I said before, comes from across the street underground and would pour into the side of the wheel and turn it, and the gears would turn the grindstones up top. Later on, when it was converted to a cider mill, the technology had changed by then, and the wheel was replaced with a turbine, which we still see down here, and a lot of the building was restructured around cider mill cider pressing rather than grinding flour or corn. We have a conveyor taking apples into the building over there. Behind me, we have a conveyor for taking peaches, and These two conveyors carry up the fruit to the top of the mill, where it starts the process of going from a whole fresh fruit, into liquid cider.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the walls? They're really thick.
The walls are very thick because with each floor as it goes up, the wall gets thinner by about a foot and creates a ledge that the floor beams sit on. But the reason it's so cold, and you could feel how much colder it gets when you walk into the building down here, is that partially we're underground, and so it's the ground temperature that you feel, but also the walls are so thick that it takes them a long time to heat and cool. And in the summertime it's cool in here, and then in the cold of winter you might walk in and you'll feel warmer because the building insulates the heat and the cold so much better than wood structures. The structure dates originally to 1848, and it was a grist mill for about 50 or 60 years and became a cider mill in 1910. And it operated as a cider mill from 1910 to 1938. And so you have almost 100 years of history producing either flour and grinding grist mill materials, and then cider, where they would make hard cider and applejack here.
So could you tell me how the apples actually get into the mill?
Well, a truck would come, drop its truckload of apples into this bin, and they'd be pushed onto what's called a conveyor, which conveys the apples from down here on the ground floor up into the building and all the way to the top where it meets the rest of the machinery. The conveyor works with a chain that is all connected to the machinery that runs off the main shaft that you saw down in the wheel pit turbine. So from that one section where the water comes in, the entire mill is powered.
So it sounds like there were a lot of apples around here.
Right. New Jersey produced more apples than any other state, and the result was that apples as a fresh fruit were not worth very much because they were all over. But if you took the apples and turned them into cider and then into applejack, you could store it better, you could ship it, it wouldn't go bad like a fresh fruit will, and it's worth a lot more. And it enabled New Jersey to have a cash crop with apples that grow well in here in the colder climate and in the hills, whereas the rest of the country had other cash crops. And so apples in a large sense were New Jersey's cash crop.
So we're up in the top of the mill now, and we saw where the apples came in at the bottom, and they go all the way up to the top, and then do they come down here?
Yeah, actually we're on the middle floor. The apples do start outside and they go in the conveyor all the way up. There's actually another floor above our heads and more machinery up there. But down here you can see the rest of the process, where they get dropped into a chopper or a grater, and that turns them into just a pulp, a mush, that comes down into this cone called a hopper, where it comes down here, and you fill up level by level with these racks in a cloth called cheeses, and you build up 4 or 5 or 6, sometimes even more cheeses. And once you have all the levels there, you put a last rack over the top, and you want to then take this under one of the presses. So this is all in a cart that can roll.
Oh wow, it moves.
It all rolls onto here. It's like a little railroad. And then onto one or the other of the 2 presses that are in here. This press is the older one. It dates from about 1875, made in Syracuse, New York. And the other one is from the same company from about 1890. But that company, Boomer and Boschert, was supplying the presses for, I think, most of the industrial cider production in the country. And we're lucky to have 2 originals here that are original to this mill and in working order. It's a rare thing. I think we're either the only or one of the only 2 where you can see the original machinery in operation.
So they would have had two presses going because they would have wanted to keep production going even while one was pressing. They wouldn't be
Right.
loading up the other one,
The
right?
press, when you want it to apply a lot of pressure down, it's moving slowly because you don't want it to be working strong and fast at the same time. It's not good for the machine. It's dangerous. But you could set this one to move down. You could come over here with another cart and start making more cheeses. You might bring those over to the other press and start that one going down by the time this one was ready to be moved out. So the cider goes through pipes into vats, and then the leftover solid part of the apple, the cores, the skins, the cellulose, would be dropped out of chutes in the walls and brought either to farms to feed livestock, or today when we have our pressing day, the deer love it for about a week afterwards.
So wait a minute, James. You were talking about making cheeses here, but you don't mean cheeses from milk, right?
No. The term is, for what you see in this layer down here, and what we're making here, is a cheese. Just like when you're making cheese, you wrap it in a cloth and you keep the solids on the inside, and that's the congealed milk fat.
You sort of squeeze the liquid out,
You have the
right?
congealed milk fat, and then the liquid or the water separates out from that. What we're doing here is similar, where the whole apples, the cellulose, the skins, the stems, the seeds, all gets trapped in the cloth, and when we put it under a press and apply the pressure, you're squeezing out the liquid part, and that's the fresh cider.
So we just saw how the apples come in to the mill and get milled up and put into the cheeses, but how do they actually get the juice out of the cheeses?
Well, once you have a cart filled with layer after layer of cheeses, you roll it on these rails and put it under a press. Like I said, you roll it so you can move them all around, and you put it under the press, and when the machinery's all running, this screw turns, that wheel turns, and the press slowly moves down this whole platform and applies pressure downward onto the apples. And the cheeses are full of the solid part of the apple, and when you apply all that pressure, you're separating out the liquid cider.
Where does it go?
It goes down through pipes in the floor into vats, where it could be stored or fermented, or you could collect it all and use it as sweet cider. But this press is almost, I think, 12 feet high. It's largely made of wood. These huge timbers up top absorb the stress from the pressure that's going down onto the apples. Those beams will actually buckle a little bit from how much force is going down onto these apples, to give you an idea of how much pressure it takes to really get all the cider out from the fruit. And this is the less productive of our two presses. We have another press that can even make more cider than this.
So how much cider could an enormous press like this make? I mean, this is a huge piece of equipment.
This is a huge piece of equipment, and I would guess it could make 1,000 or maybe 2,000 gallons of cider in a day at full speed and full operation. And it's sort of the precursor, but also the little brother to the other press that we have, which does most of the work in here.
So how did all of this amazing equipment end up still being here?
Well, it's a unique thing. In most places, this machinery that's so old would have been used for scrap, or it might have been sold and taken out of the mill. But the last owners of the cider mill, who were using it for making cider, just in effect locked the door and left everything there for decades and decades. And even though the building needed to be restored and all the machinery needed to be restored because it had been exposed to the elements, the good part was that everything was here and it could all be reassembled and put back together in working order again.
So when did they stop making cider here?
In the late 1930s. 1938, I think, was the last year that cider was pressed here, prior to the restoration of the mill and pressing again in 2008. So for 70 years, this was a dormant building.
And how did it become a museum?
Well, some local volunteers who were interested in history thought at first that maybe the building could be used, the walls and the structure could be used and adapted into some other function. But when they opened up the doors and they saw that everything was still inside, and did a little reading and found how unique it was, because we're almost the only one in the country, we might be, they said, oh no, we can't turn that building into anything else. We have to save it. And we're lucky for people who take sites like that around here and elsewhere and preserve them so that everybody can understand what it was like here not so long ago.
Do you think we can see how the machinery actually works?
I think I can turn it on, yeah.
Okay, great.
And when you're ready to raise the press back up, you would engage over here. You just have to move the belt from what's called the loose pulley to the fast pulley to put it in gear.
So once we get the juice pressed out from this giant mill, how does it actually turn into hard cider?
Well, it comes from here down into vats, and to make hard cider is fermented, what we call sweet cider, or cider like you buy in the store. Alcohol is a combination of sugar and yeast that breaks it down into alcohol. And yeast is all over, it's in the air, and it's on the surface of the apples when they get pressed. And so by the time the liquid ends up in the vats, you have the sweet cider, which is sugary, that's one of the ingredients, and the yeast still from the surface of the apples. And it's a natural process where if you let it sit, you don't want so much oxygen on it, you don't want so much light on it, but just naturally it will turn into hard cider. And there will be, after a week or so, it'll start to turn in its flavor. And you might leave it until it becomes 4, 5, 6% alcohol. And then if you take that and distill it, you get the Applejack that this region was famous for.
So can you tell me a little bit about the Applejack part of the story? Because I think I understand that for a time, this was being made secretly here.
Well, speakeasies and secret stills and secret alcohol production was happening all over. It's the worst kept secret probably in the country.
And this was
for
during
13 years, during
Prohibition.
1920s pretty much. By the early 30s, it was being repealed. But this facility, this mill, continued secretly making Applejack, like you say, and it was supplying local markets, but also the bigger cities nearby, Newark, New York. And it was out of sight, and I think that the local authorities were perfectly content knowing it was there as long as it was out of sight and they had some plausible deniability about what was going on here.
So they were actually allowed to continue pressing cider here during Prohibition.
That's right. You could keep making sweet cider because you could drink sweet cider, it's non-alcoholic, or you could make it into apple cider vinegar, which has lots of household uses. And so I think what people said was, we're going to keep our business going even though we won't be making Applejack anymore. And then secretly they kept making the Applejack.
So this is where the cider finally ends up, coming through the pipes, right?
That's right, from the presses, through the pipes, into this vat. And this is just one of 4 vats in the building. This vat can hold more than 7,000 gallons. And at that point, you're bringing cider from all different farms, dropped off. Maybe you had several truckloads today from different farmers. And it all ends up in this one place.
So what is your relationship to cider making today? I know there's a big revival of cider making in America today.
That's right, and it's happening in New Jersey too. And we're lucky that even though most of the hills that were apple orchards are now suburbs, there are still some around here. And some of their owners are good friends of ours. When we press the cider one day a year, Allsteed Farms in Chester brings their truckload of apples, and that's the apples that we press. And when we have programs, they're the ones who supply us with the little treat at the end for people to have a sample. And it's really a nice thing that this mill shows the industrial side, but it's sort of where industrial history and agricultural history come together. And that's kind of what we like to share with people in this mill.
So, is anyone making Applejack?
If people take it home after our pressing day, I don't know what they do with it.
Professor Kennedy from Rutgers University, I want to thank you for your knowledgeable questions as we toured the premises. And Mr. Malchow, thanks for showing us around. And tell us a little bit, if our viewers want to visit, what they can arrange.
Well, the cider mill's open in May, September, and October on regular weekend days. You can all find the hours and the days of the week on ralstoncidermill.org. But also we're open by appointment, so you don't have to wait for when we're open to the general public. If you have a group or an interest in coming by, just let us know and we're happy to share the building with you and for anybody else.
Thank you so much. I had such a good time seeing the building.
I'm glad you liked it.